They were only a month old. 7 tiny golden retriever puppies, starving, shaking, dumped in a cardboard box beneath the blazing sun. No food, no water, no chance. Left to die like yesterday's trash. And no one stopped. No one. Until he did. A former firefighter, broken by loss, stumbled on the scene that would change everything. What he did next will restore your faith in humanity. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. If you believe every life deserves a second chance, hit that subscribe button. Because this one will stay with you forever. The sun had already climbed halfway into the sky by the time Clay Dawson's boots crunched onto the shoulder of Highway 55, just beyond the last bus stop on the edge of Springfield, Missouri. It was mid-July, and the air was thick enough to taste, dry dust and the metallic tinge of heat radiating off the blacktop. Clay walked slowly but deliberately, his gait uneven from the old injury in his left leg. He wore a dark green work shirt rolled at the sleeves, faded jeans, and a cap stained with sweat. His shoulders were still broad from his days as a firefighter, though his back now carried a curve that hadn't been there 6 years ago, before the accident, before the building fell, before everything stopped making sense. Clay, now 45, lived a quiet, half-forgotten life on the edge of town in a home he'd built with his own hands. After the spinal compression injury ended his rescue career, he drifted away from people, from loud noises, from anything that moved too fast or promised too much. He found comfort in solitude and routine, especially his morning walks to the old industrial district where he would pick up mechanical scrap for his little garage workshop. But today's routine was about to fracture. As he passed the rusted signpost for mile marker 12, something caught his eye. A cardboard box, large, misshapen, and darkened with moisture, sat off the shoulder in the tall grass. At first, Clay thought it was trash, maybe discarded moving boxes, but then he heard it, a sound so soft it could have been imagined. A whimper. He stopped, squinted. Then he heard it again. Sharp, faint, real. He dropped the small bag of tools he was carrying and stepped carefully toward the box. The flies buzzing around it parted slightly, revealing a glimpse of soft golden fur through a torn flap. His stomach twisted. He knelt down and peeled back the damp cardboard. 7 tiny golden retriever puppies lay tangled together inside, no older than a month. Their fur, once a bright cream, was matted with filth. Their ribs showed through fragile skin, and their bodies trembled faintly in the sweltering air. One of them lifted its head and let out a hoarse, gasping cry. Clay's breath caught. He didn't hesitate. He slipped off his overshirt and gently scooped 3 of the puppies into it, wrapping them with care. He reached into the box for the rest, his hands surprisingly steady despite the flood of heat and emotion. "You're okay now?" he muttered, voice cracking. "I got you." He carried the bundle to the side of the road, carefully laying the puppies in the shade of a dying oak. He stood, ready to run, limp, back to his truck, parked half a mile down the road. Then his phone buzzed. It was a number he recognized. His jaw tightened. Jared McClellan. Clay tapped the screen with a dusty finger. "Hey!" Jared's voice came through loud and sharp. "Clay, where are you, man? The house calls in 20 minutes. I told them you'd be there by 11. Clay blinked. His face dropped. The air seemed to still. Jared was a former colleague from the firehouse, now a contractor who had offered Clay one of the few things he didn't get much anymore: a chance. Clay had agreed to help install a new security system in a client's home today. If it went well, Jared said, there could be more work. Steady, paid work. Clay needed it, more than he admitted. He was behind on his electric bill, and the city was sending warnings. I had to stop," Clay said, eyes flicking back to the whimpering pile of fur under the oak. "You can't stop," Jared snapped. "They're rich, Clay, and they're waiting. If we blow this, it's done. You want me to keep sticking my neck out for you, or what?" Clay opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He stared down the road. His truck wasn't far. If he left now, he might just make it. But the image of those pups, faintly breathing, half dead in a box, was burned behind his eyes. 5 minutes, he said quietly. "Just 5. "No, Clay, not 5. You either show up now, or I don't call again." The line went dead. Clay stood frozen, phone still in hand. He looked from the road, to the box, to the puppies beneath the tree. One of them began to convulse, legs twitching uncontrollably. Another had gone completely still. He took a step toward them, then stopped again. This was it. Go left, save the dogs, lose the job. Go right, keep the chance at stability, leave 7 innocent creatures to the sun and the silence. His jaw tightened. Sweat slid down his cheek. The hum of insects seemed to grow louder. And then, he did nothing. Not yet. He just stood there, caught between past and present, heart and survival. The sound of his boots hitting the asphalt echoed hollow in the sweltering air as Clay Dawson limped toward his truck, his breathing shallow, jaw clenched. Behind him, beneath the shade of that brittle old oak tree, 7 fragile bodies lay bundled in the work shirt he had stripped from his back. 7 newborn golden retriever pups fighting for life. His truck was just around the bend, sun-baked and aging, a 1999 Ford with flaking paint and a creaky passenger door. He opened it, threw the front seat forward, and grabbed the torn towel he kept for cleaning tools, shaking out the dust and metal shavings. Then he stopped, one hand on the seat, one foot in the truck. A silence like no other rolled over him, not from the road or the woods or the empty sky, but from inside. Her voice came back in that moment, soft, southern, unshakable. Clay, baby, if you ever see suffering and turn away, that ain't who you are anymore. And I know you. You were born to run toward the fire. He exhaled, then closed his eyes and whispered, I miss you, Deb. 3 years ago, Deborah Dawson had passed away in their bedroom after a long, bitter battle with ovarian cancer. She was only 39, a Sunday school teacher, garden lover, and the kind of woman who prayed for her enemies even after they broke her heart. She had no family except Clay and the small congregation at Willow Baptist Church. She died in spring, but Clay swore the world never grew green again. Since her passing, Clay hadn't stepped foot inside a church. He'd packed up the Bible she left by the bed, dog-eared and filled with her tiny underlines, and placed it gently in the attic. But he remembered her words, always, especially the ones she whispered during her final week when the pain was unbearable and faith was all she had left. God doesn't test the strong, he tests the willing. Clay slammed the truck door shut and turned around. He limped back down the road with renewed speed, nearly slipping on the gravel. The puppies still lay under the tree, trembling and panting. Without wasting a second, he gathered them into the towel, careful not to jostle the smallest one whose eyes wouldn't open. He drove with one hand on the wheel and the other holding the trembling bundle in his lap, mumbling to them the way Deborah used to soothe stray cats that wandered into their garden. Hang on now, just a little longer. It took 17 minutes to reach the Green Hollow Veterinary Clinic, located in a red brick building wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered antique shop. The windows were old but clean. The sign had faded letters, Bell Anderson, DVM. Clay parked crooked across 2 empty spaces and limped toward the front door, pushing it open with his shoulder. The waiting room was quiet and smelled faintly of antiseptic and dog shampoo. A woman at the front desk looked up from behind a screen. She was petite, early 30s, with straight-cut bangs and oversized glasses that magnified a pair of anxious blue eyes. Her name tag read Gina. Her voice was gentle. Sir, do you have... I need help, Clay barked, his voice cracking. Now. Gina stood immediately, knocking over a stack of appointment cards in the process. Clay unwrapped the towel enough for her to see. Her gasp was sharp. Oh my God! Dr. Bell! Moments later, a woman in her early 50s burst through the swinging back door. Dr. Bell Anderson moved like someone who never stopped moving. Tall, wiry, with her graying hair tied into a messy braid, the sleeves of her white coat rolled up to her elbows. Her face was angular and pale, with permanent crow's feet that didn't come from smiling. She looked at Clay, then at the puppies. Treatment room 3, now, she snapped. Clay followed her as she cleared a steel table, nodding to an assistant named Jess who had just come on shift, a lanky man in his 20s with curly hair, a nose piercing, and quiet eyes. Bell didn't waste time with small talk. Within seconds, gloves were snapped on, IV bags were hung, and bottles of lactated Ringer's solution lined the counter. These puppies are in critical condition, Bell said, her voice as sharp as a scalpel. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, some signs of mild poisoning, pesticide or rodenticide. They were dumped recently. You find them today? Clay nodded. This morning, in a box by the road. Belle looked at him, her eyes narrowing. You their owner? No, he said flatly. Just someone passing by. Belle grunted. Good thing you passed by. Clay stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching helplessly as they began treating each pup. Jess carefully inserted tiny IVs into their forelegs, while Belle gently palpated their abdomens, checking for bloating or signs of internal bleeding. One pup began to shake violently. Belle murmured, Come on, baby, stay with me. Clay couldn't move. His knees ached. His heart pounded with something he hadn't felt in years. Powerlessness. After nearly an hour, the puppies were each stabilized on heating pads, monitored by machines that beeped with slow, faltering rhythm. Jess left to prepare more fluids. Belle finally turned to Clay. What are you planning to do with them? I don't know, he admitted. I just couldn't walk away. They'll need round-the-clock care. It won't be cheap. Antibiotics, fluids, maybe even transfusions for one or two. I don't have much, Clay said honestly, but I'll stay, I'll help, whatever I can do. Belle studied him. There was a softness in her expression now, buried beneath decades of emotional armor. You got a name? Clay Dawson. Well, Clay Dawson, you just inherited 7 little miracles. You ready for that? He glanced at the pups. One sneezed weakly. Yeah, he said, more sure than he expected. I think I am. Later that afternoon, Clay sat on a bench in the clinic hallway, knees bouncing, watching through the glass window as Belle checked each of the pups' vitals. Gina brought him a paper cup of coffee that tasted like old pennies and soot. He didn't care. The smallest pup had finally opened its eyes. He leaned forward and whispered through the glass, That one's tough. Think I'll call her Flicker. Belle heard him and turned. You naming them now? He shrugged. Feels wrong not to. That big one who barked at me the whole ride here, he's a Rusty. Then there's the quiet one with the black ears. Midnight, the one with the stripe on her belly. Stripe. Belle smirked. Very original. Clay chuckled for the first time in what felt like years. It's a start. As evening fell, Belle pulled Clay aside. One of the pups has markers under the skin. Tiny scars from being restrained. Not random. This wasn't someone dumping an unwanted litter. These dogs were handled, possibly bred, in a controlled way. Someone wanted them gone, deliberately. Clay's expression darkened. You think this was intentional? Belle nodded. This doesn't feel like neglect. Feels like disposal. I'll contact animal control, but these cases rarely go anywhere unless someone steps forward. Clay looked back at the pups. They don't need police reports, he murmured. They need a chance. Belle crossed her arms. You sure about all this? This won't be easy. Clay thought about the job he had just lost, the call from Jared that he hadn't returned, the electric bill sitting on the kitchen counter, and the old photograph of Deborah still framed beside his bed. He looked at Belle. No one gets left behind, he said quietly. That's not how I was raised. That's not how she would have wanted it. The clinic lights were dimmed to a soft amber hue as night settled across Springfield, Missouri. Outside, the sky was velvet black, pierced with tired starlight, and the roads had long since gone quiet. Inside Green Hollow Veterinary Clinic, only the sound of shallow breathing and the faint rhythmic beep of monitors filled the recovery room. Clay Dawson sat hunched in a worn plastic chair beside the smallest kennel. His hands, rough and calloused from years of labor, rested on his thighs, twitching slightly with every shift of the bundle wrapped in towels inside the incubator. One of the puppies, just one, wasn't improving. While the others had begun to show signs of progress, soft whimpers, little tail flicks, even a sneeze here or there, this one had only declined. He'd grown cold. He hadn't cried. His little body barely moved at all. Clay hadn't taken his eyes off him for hours. Dr. Belle Anderson had come in around 10 to check vitals, her face drawn, her voice lower than usual. This little guy might not make it through the night, she said gently, placing a hand on Clay's shoulder. His organs are slowing down. The toxins hit him hardest. Clay just nodded, his jaw clenched, eyes rimmed red. He didn't speak. Belle hesitated, then added softly, You don't need to stay, Clay. If you want to rest, I'll have Jess monitor. No, Clay interrupted. I'll sit. She studied him for a moment, then simply nodded and stepped out of the room. Across the hallway, Ivy Marks was finishing up her shift. At 24, Ivy looked younger than she was. Petite, with loosely braided auburn hair, freckles dusted across her pale skin, and oversized scrubs that made her seem like she was borrowing adulthood. But there was something steady about her, something quiet and observant. Ivy didn't talk much to clients. She preferred cleaning the cages in silence or sitting with recovering animals when no one was looking. She rarely smiled, but when she did, it was small and genuine. She noticed Clay through the glass window of the recovery room. He hadn't moved in nearly an hour. She dried her hands on a towel, sighed, and walked down the hall to the break room. She returned a few minutes later with a small thermos and a chipped mug. "I brought coffee," she said softly through the doorway. "It's terrible, but hot." Clay looked up, blinking. "Thanks." She stepped in slowly, placing the mug beside him on the table. Her eyes flicked to the pup. "He's not doing great," Clay murmured, voice thick. "They said he might not make it." Ivy nodded slowly. "Sometimes they don't, but sometimes they surprise you." Clay let out a dry laugh. "Feels like everything I touch falls apart these days." Ivy didn't respond right away. She just sat in the corner quietly. Then she asked, "What made you stop that morning?" Clay didn't answer for a while. Then he said, "Heard a sound. Just a little whimper. Like it wasn't done crying yet. I don't know. I just couldn't leave them." "That doesn't make you weak, you know," Ivy said. "It makes you different from the people who did." There was silence for a time. Then Ivy stood. "I've been thinking of posting something," she said carefully. "Not for attention. Just people should know. About them. About you." Clay looked at her. "No names, no photos of me, just them." She smiled faintly. "Okay." And with that, she left, her footsteps soft against the floor. Later that night, Clay remained by the incubator. The pup's breathing was uneven, his limbs twitching faintly, as though fighting something invisible. Clay placed 2 fingers gently on the towel beside him, not touching, just there. He whispered like he used to when Deborah was sick and trembling in their bed. "You're not alone. Not tonight." Hours passed. At one point he laid his head on the edge of the kennel and closed his eyes, not sleeping, just resting in the silence. A memory came to him then. Deborah, in their old kitchen, humming an old hymn while she watered the plants by the windowsill. She used to say there was something sacred in tending to the weak, in showing up for life, even when it didn't show up for you. Around 3:40 a.m., the pup let out a tiny cough. Clay snapped upright. The puppy had shifted. Not much, but enough for Clay to notice the chest rising just slightly steadier than before. Another breath. Another twitch. Clay leaned closer. "Come on, little guy, just stay with me." Then, barely audible, a soft, high-pitched yawn escaped the puppy's mouth. It wasn't strength, but it wasn't death either. It was fight. Clay sat back in the chair, exhaling for the first time in what felt like hours. His shoulders trembled. He didn't cry, but for the first time in years, something broke loose in his chest. Something warm. Not relief, not victory. Just connection. Like the walls he'd built around himself had thinned just enough for light to get in. This wasn't duty. It wasn't guilt. It felt like family. The kind that didn't need words. The kind that breathed and whimpered and existed only because someone stayed through the worst of it. By sunrise, the pup was still alive. Not healed, not safe, but alive. Clay finally stood and stretched his back. He looked around at the room, the soft morning light spilling in through the blinds, the distant smell of antiseptic and wet fur. For the first time in 6 years, he didn't feel like a ghost walking someone else's life. He felt placed. At that same moment, Ivy sat in the front lobby, watching her phone. Her post from earlier had begun to spread. She had uploaded a single image of the incubator, with the puppy barely visible inside. No names, no faces, just a caption. This little soul was left to die in a box. But someone stayed beside him all night. Not because they had to, because they couldn't leave. Sometimes the fight for life starts with just being there. By noon, it had been shared 12,000 times. The morning sun pierced through the blinds at Green Hollow Clinic, warm and golden, casting long streaks of light across the linoleum floor. Birds chirped outside, as if declaring a quiet victory. Inside the recovery room, Clay Dawson leaned over the smallest kennel and smiled, lines around his tired eyes softening. The puppy who nearly died, the tiny one he had watched over through the darkest hours, was now awake. Weak, but breathing steadily, nestled against his siblings. Clay pressed a hand to the glass of the incubator, whispering, "You made it, little fighter." It had been 4 days since he had carried the 7 pups into the clinic, wrapped in his shirt and trembling in heat stroke. In that time, everything had changed. The pups had survived the worst of it. They were eating soft formula, wagging tails, and letting out squeaky barks that barely echoed through the clinic halls. And at last, they had names. Not just names, but stories. Belle Anderson had insisted on it. One evening, as Clay sat on the floor feeding them from a dropper, she walked in holding a clipboard and said, "If they're going to make it, they need more than medicine. They need identity." Clay had chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "You sound like Deb," he had muttered without thinking. Belle raised an eyebrow. "Deb?" "My wife," he said quietly. "She passed 3 years ago." Belle had nodded, her tone softening. "Then let's honor her. You named them. I'll write them down." And so he had. The biggest male with a bold bark became Bramble, the quiet female who always sat at the edge, Sage, the one with the curly fur who liked to climb the blanket pile, Scout, the pup with the nervous yips and wide eyes, Whisper, the cheerful one who wagged at everyone, Sunny, the one who growled whenever touched but always curled up closest, Flint, and the smallest, who almost didn't make it, Hope. Each name came from a place deep inside Clay, each one a fragment of something he'd once lost or needed to remember. That morning, Clay and Belle stood near the front counter of the clinic, sipping coffee from mismatched mugs. Belle wore her usual rumpled lab coat and faded jeans, her long braid tucked behind her shoulder. She looked down at a map spread across the counter. "This is where you found them?" she asked, pointing to a red marker near mile 12. "Yeah," Clay replied. "They were dumped just before the old fence line." Belle tapped the map thoughtfully. "There used to be a farm out there. Henderson property, I think. Been abandoned for years." Clay narrowed his eyes. "Could be worth checking out." "You're not thinking of going out there, are you?" "I'm not planning a stakeout," he said. I don't like unanswered questions." Belle didn't respond, but something in her gaze softened with concern. Meanwhile, in the back room, Ivy Marks was crouched beside Hope's kennel, gently brushing her ears with a soft cloth. Ivy's fingers moved with the precision of someone trained, but the tenderness of someone healing. Her auburn hair was tied in a loose bun, and her scrubs bore tiny embroidered paw prints. She hummed quietly, an old lullaby she couldn't place. When Hope sneezed and rolled to one side, Ivy smiled. As she cleaned, something caught her eye. A tiny bump near Hope's neck. Not a wound, not a tick. Something harder. She gently parted the fur and leaned closer. A microchip. Or, more accurately, a chip that had been partially removed. The skin around it bore the faint scar of a rushed, improper extraction. Her heart raced. She grabbed a magnifying scope from the counter and peered at the marking. Part of a serial number remained visible, etched in tiny black font. "I need Belle," she whispered. Moments later, Belle and Clay entered the room. Ivy pointed. "She has a microchip. Someone tried to pull it out, but it wasn't done cleanly." Belle frowned, crouching down. "That's not normal. Most chips don't get tampered with unless someone's hiding something." Ivy's voice was calm, but firm. "We might be able to trace it. If I can cross-reference what's left of the cereal with the vet manufacturer database, it's a long shot. But I was trained for this." Clay looked at her, surprised. "You studied veterinary science?" 2 years, she said simply. Before things changed." Belle nodded. "Go, see what you can find." It took Ivy nearly 2 hours. She pulled her laptop into the corner of the staff room and typed in silence. Using fragments of the number and access to the microchip registry, she triangulated a match from a clinic 60 miles away. A dog matching Hope's age and coat color had been vaccinated and chipped under a breeder's account. Ashgrove Kennels. The contact number was disconnected. The address led to a P.O. box. When she returned to the others, Ivy held out the printed file. "Ashgrove Kennels," she said, "but it's not a real place anymore. Looks like it shut down last year." Clay took the paper, brow furrowed. Someone's covering their tracks. Belle leaned back. Or running from something. That evening, Clay drove out to the old Henderson farm. The road was rough, overgrown. His truck rattled and groaned as it rolled over rocks and broken asphalt. When he reached the property line, he stepped out and stared. The barn was half collapsed. The fields were dry and forgotten. But the gate, old and rusted, was chained shut with a padlock that looked surprisingly new. He walked the perimeter. Faint tire tracks, recent ones, cut through the dirt near the rear entrance. Inside the barn, through a broken plank, he saw remnants of wire cages stacked along one wall. A torn bag of dry dog food, an empty syringe. He didn't need more. This had been a breeding ground. Maybe still was. He snapped a few photos and returned to his truck, pulse quickening. Back at the clinic, Ivy stayed late with the pups. As the sky turned pink outside, she held Hope in her lap, brushing her tiny head. "We'll get them," she whispered. "Whoever hurt you. We'll find them." Clay returned just after sunset, tossing his phone onto the counter with the photos pulled up. "They were kept in that barn," he said. "I'm sure of it." Belle sighed. "Then we've got work to do." It began with a sound, a dry, rasping cough from the corner kennel just before dawn, sharp enough to pierce the silence of the clinic and jolt Clay Dawson from his light doze. He rubbed his eyes and shuffled to the crate where Bramble, the boldest of the puppies, lay curled in a tight ball. The pup coughed again, this time accompanied by a soft whimper and a streak of saliva down his chin. Clay knelt beside him, alarm spiking in his chest. "Hey, easy there, boy," he murmured, opening the crate and gently lifting Bramble into his arms. The puppy was warm, too warm, feverish. Minutes later, another sound followed from across the room, a shallow yelp. Whisper, the anxious one with the always alert eyes, was lying on his side, trembling, his breathing ragged. Clay staggered to his feet, calling out as he turned the corner into the hallway. "Belle! Ivy!" Dr. Belle Anderson, already halfway through her morning rounds, rushed in seconds later, still in her dark blue scrubs, her braid tied high. Ivy followed close behind, hair pulled into a messy ponytail, eyes still clouded from sleep. Belle's tone was sharp and clipped. "Vitals! Get me their temps, respiration, gum color. We need fluids, subcutaneous now. Ivy, page Jess. Tell him to prep the isolation room." The puppies were quickly moved, their small bodies laid on clean pads under soft heating lamps. Belle worked fast, murmuring reassurances under her breath as she examined them. Clay stood at the edge of the room, gripping the doorframe with white knuckles. It was happening again. The helplessness, the fear, the sense of losing something before it had a chance to truly begin. Within the hour, both Bramble and Whisper were placed in quarantine. The preliminary diagnosis: an infection, possibly viral, likely a side effect from weakened immune systems. Belle didn't sugarcoat it. "We need to keep them isolated and watched around the clock. It could spread. If the others show symptoms..." She stopped, letting the silence fill the end of that sentence. Clay slumped into a chair in the hallway, shoulders bowed, hands dangling between his knees. He hadn't slept more than a few hours in days. His back ached, his leg throbbed with every step. And now this. He felt the old despair clawing its way up again, the kind that whispered in his darkest moments that he wasn't enough, that he failed at saving people, and now, even puppies. Ivy approached quietly, crouching beside him. "They're strong," she said. "You gave them a fighting chance." Clay didn't look up. "And what if it's not enough? What if this was all for nothing?" Ivy hesitated, then placed a hand on his arm. "You didn't walk away. That's what matters." Belle returned with a clipboard. "We've started antibiotics. It's wait and see now." Clay nodded absently and pushed himself to his feet. "I'll stay by the glass." "You should rest," Belle offered. He shook his head. A few hours passed. Clay remained seated outside the isolation room, eyes fixed on the two pups. Their tiny chests rose and fell with effort, and their tails lay limp. Around noon, Gina, the clinic receptionist with thick-rimmed glasses and a gentle voice, approached with a small envelope in hand. "This came for you," she said, holding it out. Clay blinked. "For me?" Gina nodded. "Delivered by hand. Some kid asked for you by name." He took the envelope carefully. It was made of construction paper, folded unevenly with "To Mr. Clay" scrawled on the front in crayon. Inside was a handwritten letter, printed in careful blocky script. Dear Mr. Clay, my name is Liam. I'm 8. My mom showed me the picture of you with the puppies on the internet. I saw the little one that almost died and how you stayed with him. I think you're a hero. I lost my dog last year, and it hurt a lot. But knowing someone like you is out there makes me feel better. Thank you for saving them. P.S. I hope the puppies love you forever. Clay stared at the letter, and something in him cracked, not with despair, but with something gentler. He smiled. For the first time that day, he smiled. Later that evening, as the sun cast golden beams through the clinic windows, Clay brought his chair back to the side of the glass and sat tall. Ivy returned from a grocery run and paused beside him, noticing the letter folded in his shirt pocket. Feeling better? She asked. He nodded. A kid wrote me a thank you letter. Didn't think I'd ever be someone a kid looked up to again. You're more than you know, Ivy said, then hesitated. You remind me of my dad. He passed when I was 15, quiet, tough, but when he looked at animals, he turned soft, like they were his second language. Clay looked at her for a moment, surprised. Thanks, he said simply. She sat beside him. Together they watched as Bramble shifted slightly in his basket, one paw twitching, mouth moving as if in a dream. A good sign. Whisper let out a faint sigh and curled tighter into his blanket. Hope, the smallest of the 7, approached the glass from the other side, sniffing at it curiously, as if sensing the change in energy. Ivy chuckled softly and knelt to tap the glass gently. They're watching over their own. In that moment, it didn't matter that 2 were still ill. It didn't matter that Clay hadn't slept, or that Bills waited at home. What mattered was the quiet courage in that room. The kind that didn't roar, but whispered back at the darkness, not today. It started with the chip, not the puppy, not the box, not even the barn. It started with the fractured little microchip Ivy had discovered in Hope's neck, a partial serial number, a botched removal, and a ghost kennel name, Ashgrove. But Clay Dawson had been a firefighter too long not to recognize the smell of smoke. And when something smelled wrong, you didn't ignore it. You followed it. That morning, Ivy found Clay hunched over the counter at the clinic's front desk, sifting through printouts, phone logs, and a notebook with his jagged handwriting filling every margin. He hadn't shaved in days. His salt and pepper beard had grown scruffy, and his eyes were puffy from lack of sleep. Still, he was focused. You're not going to find the whole answer in those, Ivy said as she placed a cup of black coffee beside him. He looked up, blinking, and offered a faint smile. Probably not, but I'm close to finding the next breadcrumb. Ivy, still in her green scrub pants and faded hoodie, tied her hair back and leaned on the counter. Let me guess, Ashgrove Kennels? Closed last year, supposedly, Clay said. But look here. He pushed forward a printed address change form. The name's dead, but the post office forwarded their mail for 4 months. There's a new address, north of town, outside city limits. Ivy's eyebrows lifted. You think someone's still running a breeding operation? He nodded. Or worse. An hour later, they were in Clay's pickup, heading north. The air was thick with humidity, and storm clouds gathered low in the distance. Ivy sat with her feet up on the dashboard, scribbling notes into her old veterinary school notebook. The chip company confirmed 6 other dogs registered under that same breeder code in the last 2 years, all unaccounted for. Same breed? Golden retrievers, Ivy said. All puppies, all female. Clay's jaw tightened. They were selling them, maybe even exporting. The new address led them to a private property nestled behind a dense patch of oak and pine. The mailbox was old and rusted, leaning sideways. There was no gate, but a long gravel path curved into the trees, disappearing out of sight. Clay stopped the truck a good 100 feet from the path. We walk from here, he said. Ivy hesitated, then climbed out. You always this cautious? I've had roofs fall on me, Clay muttered. It teaches you to respect what you can't see. They moved slowly through the trees, brushing past tall grass and branches. The sound of birds quieted as they neared the clearing. What they saw next made Ivy freeze. A series of long, low wooden sheds stretched along the side of a clearing. Several had padlocks on them. Others stood open, empty, with straw and food bowls still scattered across the floor. A single generator hummed near the back, next to a silver trailer that looked lived in but not well kept. The whole area reeked faintly of bleach and dog waste. This was active not long ago, Clay said, scanning the ground. Maybe still is. Ivy knelt by a shed door, peering through the cracks. Look! Inside were old crates, wire cages stacked in pairs. Several were broken, rusted at the hinges. Some had bedding still inside, and faint scratch marks on the walls. Clay's voice was tight. They kept them like this. Ivy didn't reply. Her hands trembled. Suddenly, from the far end of the clearing, a sound broke through. A door slamming. Clay and Ivy ducked behind the nearest shed. Footsteps, heavy ones. Then a voice, gruff, male, late 40s maybe. I told you we shouldn't come back here today. Another voice, this one female, tense. Just grab the damn paperwork and let's go. Clay motioned to Ivy. We have to move, quietly. They crept back through the tree line, careful not to snap a branch. Once at the truck, Ivy climbed in and gasped for breath. That was them, she whispered. That had to be them. Clay nodded. We need proof, photos, evidence, something to show animal control. Or the police, Ivy said, pulling out her phone. I'm going back tonight, with my camera. You're not going back alone, Clay said. She looked at him. You sure you're up for another long night? He smiled faintly. Been living in long nights for years. Later that day, back at the clinic, Ivy uploaded the photos they had taken. Cages, the shed interior, even the license plate of the trailer parked in the back. She organized it all into a digital folder and backed it up 3 times. That evening, a new visitor came to the clinic. A woman in her early 60s, tall and elegant in a dusty linen coat, hair silver and tied neatly at the nape. Her name was Sarah Gentry, a retired state prosecutor who now volunteered with an underground network of animal cruelty investigators. Bell had called her. Sarah walked with the poise of someone used to standing in courtrooms, and her voice had the kind of calm authority that silenced chaos. You've stirred a hornet's nest, she told Clay and Ivy as they reviewed the evidence together, but you've done good. With what you've got here, we can get a warrant. Ivy asked, what happens to the people running it? If they're linked to sales, shipping, or dogfighting, Sarah replied, they'll be charged. And if any of these pups can be connected to that location, they'll serve time. Clay crossed his arms. Then let's connect them. The courtroom was smaller than Clay Dawson had expected. No grand oak arches, no towering columns, just beige walls, fluorescent lights, and a single state flag drooping slightly in the corner. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that this was the place where the truth would finally be heard, and he was here to speak it. Clay stood near the witness stand, a folded piece of paper in his hand, his knuckles white. He wore a charcoal blazer borrowed from Bell, slightly tight in the shoulders, and the same black boots he'd worn the day he found the puppies. His beard had been trimmed that morning, not for vanity, but to show respect, for the court, for the lives that had almost been discarded like trash. Seated beside him was Sarah Gentry, her silver hair pinned neatly, her linen suit perfectly pressed. Her calm, composed manner hadn't changed since they met at the clinic. She'd spent her entire career turning emotion into evidence, passion into prosecution. And today, she was once again at work. But this time, she wasn't doing it alone. At the defense table sat 2 individuals Clay recognized instantly. Rex Holter, late 40s, stocky build, closely shaven head, cold eyes that scanned the room like he owned it. And Lena Marks, mid-30s, thin frame, dark eyeliner smudged under her eyes, lips pursed tight. The same voices they had heard near the barn weeks ago. Both were charged with multiple counts: animal cruelty, illegal breeding operations, obstruction of investigation, and tampering with evidence. Judge Eleanor Dawes, a tall, commanding woman in her early 60s, with sharp cheekbones and a steady gaze, sat high on the bench. She had presided over dozens of high-profile abuse cases, but there was something in her tone, clipped but reverent, that told Clay she wasn't treating this one as routine. The prosecutor stood and nodded toward the stand. Mr. Dawson, would you please describe the condition in which you found the animals? Clay adjusted the mic. His voice was low at first, but steadied as he spoke. They were in a cardboard box, he began. 7 golden retriever puppies, no older than 4 weeks. It was a 100-degree day. No water, no food. They were tangled in each other, covered in filth. One of them had stopped moving. Another had open sores on its back legs. When I picked them up, I didn't know if they'd survive the ride to the clinic. The courtroom fell quiet. And you weren't their owner? No, Clay said, shaking his head. I didn't know who they belonged to, but the second I saw them, I knew someone had meant for them not to be found. He described the fevered nights, the near loss of one of the pups, the chipped microchip that Ivy discovered, the location of the barn, the tire tracks, the cages, the syringes, the voices they heard, every detail. He ended with a line that silenced even the defense attorneys. They were bred for profit, used like inventory, and when they couldn't sell them anymore, they threw them away like garbage. But they weren't garbage. They were lives. When Clay stepped down, Ivy took his place. She looked small on the witness stand, barely 5'3", her scrubs replaced by a black blouse and dark jeans. Her auburn hair had been tied back tightly, and she held a photo in her hand, the picture she had taken that night of Clay sitting beside Hope, the smallest pup, in the incubator. "My name is Ivy Marks," she said. "I work at Green Hollow Veterinary Clinic. I was there when Clay brought them in." The prosecutor nodded. "And can you explain the discovery you made on one of the puppies?" "Yes," she said. "I found a microchip, partially removed. The number had been filed off, but I was able to recover enough digits to trace it to a kennel registry called Ash Grove Kennels. When I dug further, I found that they had received dozens of chips over a 2-year span." She paused. "That's how we found the address." The prosecutor let the moment hang. "Ivy, I understand you also wanted to make a personal statement." Ivy glanced at the judge, who nodded. Then she looked toward the defense table. "My mother was a groomer," Ivy began, voice trembling. "We used to take in rescue dogs. But when I was 16, we bought a puppy, golden retriever, from a classified ad. The man said it came from a small family breeder, but 3 weeks later, the dog had seizures, parasites, internal injuries. It died within the month. We later found out it was part of a mass litter from a puppy mill operating under a fake name." She swallowed hard. "My mom was devastated. She tried reporting it. No one listened. A year later, she died in a car accident, and I never had a chance to help her finish what she started." Judge Dawes leaned forward slightly, hands folded. "Miss Marks, are you saying that the defendant's operation is connected to the same network?" "I'm saying the pattern is the same," Ivy replied. "And if it isn't them, it's people like them, hiding behind unregistered addresses and shell kennel names, who are fueling this cruelty. It's systematic. It's deliberate. And it's wrong." Gasps rippled across the gallery. Later that afternoon, the jury returned. The foreman stood, tall and somber. "On all counts, we find the defendants guilty." Judge Dawes did not hesitate. "For operating an unlicensed breeding facility, for willful abandonment of animals, and for criminal negligence resulting in prolonged suffering, you are each sentenced to 5 years incarceration without parole and an additional 5 years probation. You are banned from owning or operating any facility involving animals for the duration of your life." As the gavel came down, a wave of quiet relief passed through the room. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Reporters snapped photos, microphones stretched toward Clay, who blinked at the attention like a man waking from a long nap. One asked, "Clay, how does it feel to be a hero?" He shook his head. "I'm no hero. I just couldn't walk away." Ivy stepped beside him and added, "But maybe someone else won't walk away now either." Later that night, Clay returned to the clinic. The puppies, now thriving, ran to greet him. Bramble barked and bounced, Sunny yipped in delight, and Hope curled up against his boot, warm and safe. Clay knelt among them, fingers sinking into soft fur. The world could talk of headlines and justice and victory, but all he cared about was this. They were alive. They had a chance. And maybe, just maybe, so did he. The morning sun poured down like honey over the fields just beyond the edge of Springfield, Missouri. A light breeze rustled the grass, and laughter echoed from somewhere near the barn. In the middle of the newly built yard, 7 golden retriever pups chased each other in dizzying circles, tails wagging, ears flapping, their golden coats catching the light like spun gold. They were healthy, happy, alive. It was nothing short of a miracle. Clay Dawson stood near the white fence, his arms resting over the top rail, a soft smile beneath his trimmed beard. His boots were dusted from morning chores, and the back of his button-down shirt stuck slightly to his shoulders from the heat. But he didn't mind. This wasn't work anymore. This was purpose. Behind him stood the newly finished building, a warm, cedar-paneled structure with wide doors, tall windows, and a sign carved by hand, Golden Haven Rescue and Recovery. Below the name were etched 7 small paw prints in a row. It had taken less than 2 months, but the change felt deeper, like it had grown over years. The funding came unexpectedly. 2 weeks after the trial, Clay had received a letter from the National Animal Welfare Foundation. The director, a former shelter worker named Nancy Kellner, had read about the trial in a national newsletter. She was in her late 50s, tall, with soft eyes behind square glasses and a no-nonsense way of speaking. "We don't usually fund private rescues," she had said during their first meeting, "but there's something different about what you built. You didn't just rescue dogs, you reminded people what grace looks like." With her help and Belle's planning, the dream took form. The facility would house up to 15 rescues at a time, focusing on abused and neglected dogs needing long-term recovery. But it would be more than that. It would be a place for people, too. Clay didn't want cages and kennels. He wanted healing on both sides of the leash. Inside, the main room smelled of cedar and dog biscuits. Cushioned beds lined the walls, and soft music played low through the speakers. Belle Anderson was at the back desk, her reading glasses perched low on her nose as she reviewed supply invoices. She wore her usual rolled sleeves, a pencil stuck behind one ear. When Clay walked in, she didn't look up. "Tell me the coffee machine is fixed," she said without lifting her eyes. Clay chuckled. "Better. I upgraded it. We got one with timers and 2 pots. I figured with how often you and Ivy run on caffeine, it's a safety investment." Belle snorted, then glanced up. "Smart man." He leaned against the counter. "Speaking of Ivy, she gone already?" Belle nodded. "Left this morning, early." Clay grew quiet for a moment. "She looked proud," Belle added, softening, "and nervous." After everything they'd been through together, Ivy Marks had finally made her decision to go back to school. The trauma of losing her mother, the years she spent numbing that pain, had faded just enough for her to believe in something again. With the help of the Foundation's scholarship offer and letters of support from Belle and Sarah Gentry, she had been accepted to finish her veterinary program at the University of Missouri. The night before she left, she had come to the rescue center alone. The sun had just dipped below the trees, and the yard was awash in golden light. She sat beside Hope, the smallest pup who had nearly died in the clinic, and whispered something into her ear. Then she hugged Clay without saying a word and walked away. Back outside, Clay walked to the edge of the pasture, where the pups had now collapsed in a pile under the shade of an oak tree. Hope lay curled at the center, her breathing slow and even, eyes fluttering closed. Scout rested one paw over her side. Bramble and Sunny nipped at each other half-heartedly before flopping into the grass. A voice called from the barn. Jess, the lanky, curly-haired assistant who had once been unsure around Clay, but now spoke to him like an old friend. "Hey, boss, someone dropped off a donation box, left it by the front gate." Clay waved. "Be right there." He took one more look at the dogs before heading down the path. Every step echoed with memory, not just of pain and trial, but of transformation. This place was no longer haunted by silence. It hummed with new beginnings. At the front gate, a box of supplies sat neatly with a note taped to the side. It read, "For Golden Haven, for the dogs who made us believe again. Liam and Mom." Clay felt his throat tighten. He remembered the boy's letter. He still kept it in a drawer near the coffee pot. He brought the box inside, unpacked toys, chew treats, and a handmade blanket with the words "You are loved" sewn into the fabric. Later that afternoon, Sarah Gentry stopped by. She wore her usual tailored coat, despite the heat, and brought a clipboard of legal forms. "You're official," she said. "Nonprofit status, registered license, tax ID. It's all real now." Clay shook her hand, chuckling. "Guess I better stop calling this my backyard project." Sarah smiled. "You've built something rare, Clay. A place where broken things come back better." He watched her drive away and turned to find Belle standing on the porch. "You're still not used to this, are you?" she asked. Clay scratched his beard. "Used to what?" "Being someone people look up to." He looked out across the fields where the dogs were playing again. "No," he said, but I'm getting better at letting myself believe I might deserve it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the golden fields, the dogs gathered around Clay like a living halo. He sat in the grass, back against the tree, and let them climb into his lap, rest their heads on his boots, lick his hands. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was trying to heal the world. He felt like he was home. Sometimes, God doesn't speak through thunder or fire. Sometimes, he speaks through the softest bark, the smallest whimper, or the gentle eyes of a soul that just needs to be seen. Clay didn't go looking to be a hero. He simply listened to that quiet voice inside, the one that nudges us to stop, to notice, to love without condition. This story reminds us that every life matters, no matter how broken, forgotten, or small. And just like Clay, we all have the power to be a vessel of healing, whether to a person, an animal, or even ourselves. As it is written in Proverbs 12:10, the righteous care for the needs of their animals, and perhaps in doing so, we begin to understand the heart of God more deeply. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment Amen if you believe every creature deserves love. Subscribe for more real stories that remind us of the goodness still alive in this world. May God bless you and your loved ones abundantly, and may we all keep our hearts open to listen, to rescue, to love. Deep in the misty forests of Asheville, North Carolina, a retired firefighter was just doing his daily patrol when his old German Shepherd Bear suddenly froze, then bolted. What Bear led him to wasn't a fallen branch or a wild animal. It was a little girl, half buried under leaves, shaking, silent, and clearly terrified. Ethan's heart stopped. What had this child been through, and why? Was she clutching his dog like he was the only thing keeping her alive? Before we begin this emotional journey, tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from today? The morning mist curled low over the forested slopes of Asheville, North Carolina, painting the Blue Ridge in tones of soft gray and winter green. It was early spring, but the air still carried a chill, sharp and wet, soaked with the scent of pine and damp earth. Dew clung to the underbrush like forgotten memories. The sun struggled to break through the clouds, casting faint beams of light that flickered through the trees like ghosts passing overhead. Ethan Clay adjusted the worn canvas strap of his field bag, his heavy boots crunching softly on the moss-covered path as he moved with practiced steps. At 48, he bore the look of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. His salt and pepper beard was cropped close to a square jaw, and his pale green eyes were shaded with permanent tiredness. The lines on his face weren't just from age, but from grief etched deep, unyielding. Once a fierce firefighter known for his calm under pressure, Ethan had withdrawn from city chaos after his wife, Claire, passed away from leukemia 5 years ago. Since then, he had transferred to the quieter rhythms of rural fire patrol, working mostly solo, walking trails, checking fire lines, and breathing in silence. By his side trotted Bear, a 5-year-old German Shepherd, muscular yet lean, with a black saddle and warm tan fur flecked with silver. Bear was no ordinary companion. Once a certified rescue K9 trained to locate survivors under rubble and snow, Bear had retired early after an injury during a mountain landslide operation, left his right hind leg with a faint but permanent limp. Despite the slight flaw, the dog moved with purpose, head held high, eyes ever alert, scanning the forest as if memories lived in the trees. Ethan took a slow sip from his thermos and paused near a wide clearing where the sunlight finally managed to pierce the mist. It was the place he always stopped for a break. Habitual, comforting. Bear sniffed the air and paced in tight circles, ears twitching. Ethan didn't think much of it at first. Squirrels, maybe, or deer. Then Bear froze, his tail stiffened. Head low, shoulders tense. That posture, Ethan hadn't seen it since active field days. Not casual, not curious. Something was wrong. Before Ethan could speak, Bear took off like a shot, darting through brambles and branches like the forest itself parted for him. "Bear! Hey, wait up!" Ethan's voice cracked through the woods as he shoved the thermos into his bag and sprinted after him. Branches scraped his arms, wet leaves slapped against his chest, but he kept moving, his heart pounding not just from the run, but from a sudden, unexplained fear rising in his gut. The dog disappeared ahead, only the rustle of disturbed underbrush tracking his trail. Then, nothing. Silence. Ethan stumbled into a dense thicket, breath catching as he spotted Bear standing still, rigid beside a fallen tree, his head bent low. The dog let out a low whimper, soft, almost like mourning. And there, beneath the tangled roots of the fallen pine, lay a child. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was a little girl, no older than 7, curled up like a leaf blown against stone. Her clothes were torn and soaked with dirt. Pale scratches crisscrossed her arms and legs, and her bare feet were raw with cold. Her face was streaked with dried tears and grime, and her brown curls stuck to her cheeks in wild knots. She wasn't unconscious, but close to it, eyes cracked open only slightly, unfocused. Bear nudged her gently with his nose, then stepped back, ears folded. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, careful not to frighten the girl. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly, voice shaking. "You're okay now. I'm here." The girl didn't flinch, but she didn't speak either. She just stared at Bear, then slowly, painfully, reached out and gripped the dog's fur with both hands, burying her face into his shoulder. Ethan's throat tightened. The way she clung to Bear, it wasn't the fear of strangers, it was survival. Desperate, silent survival. He took off his jacket and draped it over her tiny frame. The cold air bit through his thin thermal shirt, but he didn't care. "I've got you," he murmured, gently placing a hand behind her back, trying to check for injuries without startling her. "I need to get you somewhere warm. I'm not going to hurt you, I promise." Still, no words. Bear pressed close beside her, his tail curled around her side protectively, eyes never leaving Ethan's. He pulled his radio from his bag. "Dispatch, this is Clay. I have a child, female, approximately 7 years old, found alone in Sector 12, Northeast Ridge. Alive but unresponsive. I'm heading to base camp now. Prepare medical." A crackle. "Copy that, Clay. We're alerting EMT and Sheriff's Department. ETA 30. Ethan wrapped the girl tighter, feeling how light she was. Too light. Starvation wasn't unfamiliar to him. He had seen it after hurricanes and house fires. But this was something different. This wasn't lost. This was left. He picked her up carefully. She made no sound, only pressed her face further into Bear's side. Bear walked close at his heels as they made their way back to the trail, his body angled outward like a shield, constantly watching the woods. As they descended toward the service road, Ethan couldn't shake the sensation crawling down his spine. Someone had left her here. Someone had hurt her. But the worst part was something deeper. The stillness in her gaze. The silence. He'd seen shell shock in soldiers, in burn victims, in children pulled from collapsed buildings. But never like this. Never so complete. Who had done this to her? And why had Bear known exactly where to find her? Ethan's truck groaned as it crawled up the gravel path toward the fire station, its headlights cutting through the mist that still clung stubbornly to the forest floor. The girl sat beside him, small and motionless, wrapped in his thick flannel jacket, which dwarfed her like a blanket. She hadn't made a sound since he'd lifted her from the roots of that fallen tree. Not a cry, not a whisper. Her eyes stared blankly ahead, only coming alive, just barely, when Bear leaned forward from the back seat to rest his head gently on her lap. She didn't look at Ethan. Only Bear. The Asheville Ridge Fire Station wasn't much. A converted ranger outpost perched at the edge of a forested slope, with 2 wide vehicle bays, a short tower, and a cozy main room warmed by a wood-burning stove. It smelled faintly of pine, coffee, and old canvas. For Ethan, it had become more than a station. It was the only place that had felt like home since Claire died. He parked just outside the door and cut the engine. The silence was almost louder than the truck's rumble. For a moment, neither he nor the girl moved. Then Bear whined softly and nudged her arm. She gripped his fur tighter and finally turned to face Ethan. "I've got you," he said again, gently, as he climbed out and rounded the truck. "Let's go inside, just a little while." She didn't resist when he lifted her again, but she tensed at the creak of the door and the unfamiliar light inside. Bear padded ahead of them and immediately curled near the small sofa, his eyes following every move Ethan made as he carried the girl to the worn couch and laid her down as gently as possible. She immediately reached for Bear, who pressed close to her side without hesitation. Ethan stood for a long moment, watching. Then he turned and picked up the phone mounted to the wall beside the sink. His hands hovered above the buttons for a second, Then he punched in a number from memory. It rang twice. April Hensley speaking. April, it's Ethan. I need you to come to the station. Now. There was a pause. Then her voice dropped into something quieter. Ethan? What's going on? I found a kid in the forest. She's maybe 7. Looks like she's been out there a while. She's not talking, barefoot, scratches all over her, but she's alive. April didn't waste time with questions. I'm on my way. 15 minutes. He hung up, exhaled, and leaned against the wall. His fingers trembled slightly. It had been years since anything made him tremble. When April arrived, the sound of her small blue Subaru crunching the gravel was a strange comfort. She stepped out with a large canvas medical bag in one hand, dressed in faded jeans and a moss-green hoodie with a white cross on the chest. Her face, lightly freckled and framed with untamed ginger hair, was alert but kind. 34 and tall for a woman, she moved with the precise efficiency of someone who had been under pressure before, but the deep lines around her eyes hinted at old wounds. Years ago, she had worked emergency rooms in Charlotte before a car accident took her younger brother. She had left the city life behind and returned to Asheville, where she'd grown up, finding solace in quieter things. Gardening, volunteering, and tending to the small, scattered emergencies of mountain folk. As she stepped into the firehouse, she paused at the sight before her. The girl, curled on the couch like a broken bird, Bear beside her like a guardian statue. April's eyes flicked to Ethan, who simply nodded. She hasn't spoken, he murmured, only reacts to Bear. April crouched low, not too close, and spoke softly. Hey there, sweetheart. My name's April. I'm a nurse. I'm here to help you, if that's okay. No answer. Just that empty stare and a firmer grip on the dog's fur. April opened her bag slowly, showing her tools like a magician easing someone into wonder. I'm going to take a look at your hands, all right? No pokes, just looking. The girl didn't move, but she didn't pull away when April gently reached forward. Her fingers were scratched, the nails broken. Her wrists had faint, raw marks, thin red lines where something had rubbed or been tied. Ethan's jaw clenched at the sight. April checked her pulse, lifted her eyelids, looked inside her mouth. Mild dehydration. Maybe early hypothermia. No broken bones that I can see, but she needs rest, warmth, and fluids. I can keep her here tonight, Ethan said. I've got cots in the back, blankets, and Bear's not going anywhere. April hesitated. You sure? Ethan met her eyes. She doesn't want a hospital. I've seen what that looks like. She's not ready. April stood and gave a single nod. Okay, I'll bring some supplies tomorrow. IV kit, hydration tabs, children's antibiotics. You've still got that old emergency locker? Fully stocked. She glanced back at the girl. What's her name? Ethan shook his head. She hasn't said. April sighed and knelt beside Bear, scratching behind his ear. Well, you've done something right, haven't you, boy? Bear licked her hand and stayed pressed to the girl's side. I'll stay for a while, April added, just to make sure she settles. Ethan made coffee. They sat quietly, the 3 adults, man, woman, dog, and the one small soul between them. The fire cracked in the stove. Outside, rain began to fall in light misting sheets, tapping gently on the tin roof. An hour passed. April tried again. Do you want something to eat? Just soup or crackers? The girl turned her head slowly, toward Bear. The dog tilted his head and gave a soft woof. That was all it took. The girl shifted, sat up slowly, and reached a hand toward the thermos on the table. Ethan poured a small amount of warm chicken broth into a camping cup and handed it to her. She took it with trembling fingers, sipped, and for the first time, blinked like someone waking from a dream. What do we call her? April asked quietly. Ethan looked at the girl, her damp curls now beginning to dry, her skin still ghost pale under the firelight. She wasn't ready to give her name. That much was clear. We'll wait, he said. She'll tell us when she's ready. April looked at him, a soft sadness in her expression. You've changed. I didn't want to, Ethan replied. But maybe, he thought, as the girl lay back down beside Bear and let her eyes close, not all change was bad. The rain had turned steady overnight, falling in slow cold sheets that clung to the windows of the firehouse like a curtain drawn to keep the world out. It was a gray morning in Asheville, and the mountain air carried the kind of stillness that seemed to ask for silence. Ethan stirred a spoon through a small pot of oatmeal on the stove, glancing occasionally toward the cot in the corner where Lila still lay curled beside Bear. She had slept through the night with one hand fisted in the dog's thick coat and the other tucked under her cheek. Bear hadn't moved much either, content, it seemed, to stay by her side for as long as she needed. Ethan hadn't slept. He had kept watch from the old rocking chair, wrapped in a blanket with a book he hadn't touched, listening to the sound of her breathing and the rhythm of the rain. He was used to night shifts, used to loneliness, but this was different. This child had brought something into his life that felt like both an echo and a beginning, something raw and unfinished. April had left around midnight, promising to return with more supplies. Before she left, she had cleaned Lila's cuts and checked her hydration levels again. The girl had accepted her touch without protest, but she hadn't spoken. Not a word. Now, as Ethan ladled oatmeal into a small bowl, Lila stirred. Bear lifted his head, ears twitching at the sound of her breathing change. She sat up slowly, blinking at the soft morning light. Her face was still pale, her eyes distant, but less hollow. She looked at Ethan for a second, not quite meeting his gaze, then reached over to scratch Bear's ear. "Morning," Ethan said gently, setting the bowl down on the table. "You hungry?" Lila didn't nod, but she slid off the cot and shuffled over, barefoot and silent. Ethan handed her a spoon and stood back. She began to eat, slow and methodical, never lifting her eyes. When she finished, she surprised him by glancing at the shelf behind the couch. It was stacked with old ranger books, maps, a box of crayons he'd nearly thrown out months ago, and a few notepads he used for field reports. She reached up, took a notepad and the crayons, and returned to the cot without a word. Ethan didn't interrupt. She lay on her stomach, Bear curled beside her again, and began to draw. It went on for nearly 20 minutes. Her movements were deliberate, careful, her hands small but focused. Ethan busied himself nearby, pretending not to watch too closely, though every scratch of crayon on paper made his chest tighten with something he couldn't name. When she finally looked up, she didn't say anything, but she turned the drawing toward him. He approached slowly, knelt beside the cot. The picture was childlike but shockingly precise. A square building stood in the center of the page, thick, dark lines for the walls, a door with multiple locks, barred windows. Around it, a high metal fence topped with jagged points. Cameras drawn as black dots with squiggly cords perched on poles above. And there, in the corner of the image, a tall figure, female, loomed beside the structure. She was drawn larger than the building itself, with sharp angles for shoulders and a featureless, dark face. Ethan's throat tightened. "You were there?" Lila didn't answer. She didn't need to. Bear let out a soft whine, nudging her leg as if in comfort. Lila leaned against him without looking away from the drawing. Ethan stood and walked toward the radio. He hesitated for several long seconds, then pressed the button and made the call. "April, you up?" Her voice came groggily through the static. "Sort of. What's going on?" "She drew something. You need to see it." April arrived half an hour later, bundled in a raincoat and hiking boots. She carried a thermos of coffee in one hand and a duffel slung over her shoulder. Her red hair was pulled into a messy bun, and her eyes sharpened the moment she saw the picture. "She drew this?" she asked. Ethan nodded. April examined the image, her brow furrowed. "This is too detailed for imagination. She saw this? I think she lived in it." April looked over at Lila, who was sitting with Bear near the fire, flipping slowly through the notepad, as if deciding what to draw next. "She has restraint marks," April said quietly, kneeling beside Ethan. "I noticed them last night, but didn't want to alarm her. Rope burn, maybe zip ties, around both wrists." Ethan felt a slow fury build inside his chest. April noticed. She placed a calming hand on his arm. "We need to go slow, you know that." "She's already talking," Ethan muttered, "just not with words." April gave a small smile. "She trusts you. And that dog." Bear, hearing his name, thumped his tail but didn't lift his head. "You think the woman in the drawing is the one who hurt her?" Ethan asked. "I think," April said carefully, "that this drawing is more than memory. It's a message." They stood in silence for a moment until Bear suddenly rose from his spot, alert and tense, ears pointed toward the door. A knock came seconds later. Ethan opened it to find a stranger standing on the porch, soaked, lanky, and out of breath. "Sorry to barge in," the man said, lifting a hand in greeting. "Name's Colin. I run the logging supply shop up on Weller Ridge. Thought I saw your truck down the highway. I've got something you might want to hear." Colin Fletcher was in his mid-30s, lean and windburnt, with a constant 5 o'clock shadow and calloused hands. He was known in town for keeping to himself, but never caused trouble. Ethan waved him inside. "What's going on?" he asked. Colin nodded toward the map on the wall. "There's a property out by the old East Line, old mining storage facility. It's supposed to be abandoned, but I saw movement out there 2 nights ago. Lights, a vehicle with no plates, and someone big. Female, white coat, security camera gear." Ethan felt his heart skip. April's gaze shot to the drawing still lying on the table. Colin followed her eyes and froze. "Wait, what is that?" he asked. "That," Ethan said slowly, "is what she drew this morning." Colin looked from the page to Ethan. "That place isn't on any local map. Who the hell is she?" Ethan looked over to where Lila now sat silently, her crayon paused mid-stroke. "That's what we're trying to find out." The fire crackled low in the hearth as a sharp knock echoed through the firehouse. It was just past noon, the rain having tapered off to a slow drizzle that painted the mountain roads slick and glassy. Ethan rose from the bench, instinctively glancing toward the far end of the room where Lila sat quietly at the table, coloring again with the same intense focus she'd shown before. Bear lay at her feet, his head resting across her boots, his ears twitching at the sound from the door. The knock came again, 3 firm, measured raps. Ethan opened the door and found himself face to face with a woman who looked like she belonged in a courtroom, not on the edge of a muddy forest trail. She was in her early 40s, tall and striking in a fitted navy pantsuit that repelled the rain like it feared her. Her black hair was pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, her heels unreasonably clean, her eyes sharp and unreadable behind designer frames. "I'm looking for Ethan Clay," she said without smiling. Her voice was crisp, practiced, like someone who had introduced herself hundreds of times and never once cared if the listener remembered. "You found him," Ethan replied, keeping his tone flat. She extended a gloved hand. "Candace Thornwell. I'm Lila Rivers' legal guardian. I'm here to take her home." The name hit Ethan like a hammer to the chest. He didn't shake her hand. Behind him, Bear stood up without a sound. "I think you'd better come inside," Ethan said, stepping aside but not far. Candace entered the firehouse with the air of someone inspecting property she already owned. Her eyes flicked over the room, modest furniture, boots by the door, the kettle still whistling faintly on the stove, and landed on Lila, who had frozen mid-crayon stroke. The girl's eyes went wide, her entire body going rigid. Bear moved instantly, placing himself between the girl and the woman. The hair along his spine rose, and a low, warning growl rumbled deep in his chest. Candace stopped in her tracks. "I see the dog's been allowed to form attachments." Ethan stepped forward, his shoulders squaring. "She hasn't spoken a word since we found her. But the second she saw you, she went cold. You want to tell me why?" "I could ask the same of you," Candace replied coolly. "Why a firefighter and his dog are playing at social services." Before Ethan could respond, the door opened again. April entered, winded from her walk up the slope, a file tucked under her arm and a suspicious glare already forming on her face. She was wearing a gray wool sweater, her red hair loose and damp from the drizzle. Her entire presence changed the atmosphere, warmer, but no less guarded. "You must be the nurse," Candace said without turning. "I appreciate you looking after Lila, but I'll be taking her now." April crossed the room in 4 steps and stood beside Ethan. "Not without a conversation, you won't." Candace raised an eyebrow. "I have the paperwork." April didn't blink. "And I have a medical authority form. The girl is under my observation for 72 hours due to psychological trauma. She stays here." Candace's smile was thin and cold. "You're overstepping." "File a complaint," April said evenly. "You'll find I'm hard to rattle." Lila hadn't moved. She was now crouched behind Bear, her tiny hands balled into fists at his shoulders, eyes locked on Candace like a cornered animal waiting for the next blow. "Lila," Candace said, softening her tone with false sweetness. "It's me, darling. Don't you remember? Auntie Candace, you've had a little adventure, but now it's time to go home." The girl flinched as if struck. Ethan stepped between them. "You should leave, now." Candace's voice sharpened. This is not your decision. No, April said, holding up the signed emergency order. It's mine, and hers. She gestured to Lila. You're not touching her. Candace's eyes burned with restrained fury. I'll be contacting my attorney. Expect paperwork. April nodded once. Good. We'll be expecting it. With a flurry of tailored fabric and barely concealed rage, Candace turned and stormed out of the station. Her heels clicked down the steps, vanishing into the wet gravel. The moment the door shut, Bear relaxed. Lila remained where she was, trembling now, her eyes still fixed on the door. Ethan crouched low, his voice soft. She's gone. Lila looked up, just briefly, and then collapsed into Bear's side, hiding her face in his fur. April sat heavily in the nearby chair. She wasn't expecting resistance. Who is she really? Ethan asked. April opened the file she'd brought. Financial consultant, no history of children. She filed emergency guardianship after Lila's parents died, apparently a week after the crash. But no one's been able to confirm how close she actually was to the family. Ethan rubbed the bridge of his nose. Something's off. She didn't ask how Lila was. Didn't ask what happened. April nodded. She came to retrieve an asset, not a child. There was a silence between them, broken only by the soft rhythm of Bear's breathing and the occasional creak of the firewood. I've never seen anyone react the way Lila did to her, Ethan said. That wasn't just fear. That was terror. April looked toward the child, now fast asleep, wrapped around Bear like he was the last thing holding her to the earth. She trusts you, April said. And him? That's rare. Ethan nodded, the weight in his chest growing heavier. Feels like I'm responsible now. Are you okay with that? April asked, her voice low. Ethan looked at the girl. He didn't need to think. Yeah, he said. I am. The forest behind Asheville had a way of swallowing sound. As Ethan drove his truck slowly up the old Ranger path, tires crunching on gravel and fallen pine needles, it struck him how quiet the world became once you left the paved roads. Trees pressed in on either side, tall, watchful things coated in damp moss and speckled lichen, branches knitting together overhead like twisted fingers. Rain had passed the day before, but the earth remained heavy, breathing mist. Lila sat beside him in the front seat, small hands holding a folded map she'd marked in crayon. She didn't speak, not with words, but her gestures had become clearer over the past 24 hours. Every line she'd drawn, blue for paths, red for landmarks, black for fences, had been done with a child's simplicity, but a survivor's precision. This wasn't imagination. It was memory. Bear sat in the back seat, his body tense, ears pricked. 5 years old, with a powerful frame and the classic black and tan coat of a German shepherd, Bear had shifted from companion to protector in a way that seemed effortless. His right hind leg still bore a subtle limp from the landslide that ended his career in urban rescue, but today he was fully alert. A silent sentinel behind Lila's small form. They weren't alone. Riding in the SUV that followed behind them was Special Agent Russell Brennan. Brennan was in his early 50s, lean and clean-shaven with weathered features and prematurely silver hair cropped close. He had the air of a man who'd spent too many nights staring at documents under fluorescent lights and too many days walking through crime scenes that smelled like failure. But there was kindness beneath his sharpness, a quiet resolve that reminded Ethan of men he'd served beside in fire crews long ago. Brennan had transferred to the local field office 2 years earlier after a whistleblower case in Chicago nearly broke him. He didn't speak of it, but April had told Ethan in passing. The man was chasing redemption, same as him. They parked where the trail thinned into raw earth. Ethan helped Lila down. She stepped out carefully, boots sinking slightly into the moss. She looked smaller than ever in her borrowed rain jacket, April's old one, with sleeves rolled several times over, and clutched the map in one hand, while her other sought Bear's fur without needing to look. "This is the trail?" Brennan asked, joining them. He wore a field jacket over a black shirt and carried a shoulder bag instead of a briefcase. His holster sat just visible at his hip. "There's nothing out here on satellite images." "She says it's not visible from above," Ethan replied, lowering his voice. "Overgrown cover, natural camouflage." Brennan nodded, then looked to Lila. "And she remembers how to get there?" Lila answered not with words, but with a single deliberate nod. Then she pointed into the underbrush and started walking. They followed her. For the next hour, they moved slowly through dense forest. The terrain was uneven, thick with roots, damp with fallen leaves. But Lila never wavered. She paused now and then to orient herself, comparing the curve of a ridge or the shape of a boulder to the mental map she carried. Her gaze never left the landscape, except to glance occasionally at Bear, who padded beside her like a silent guard. Ethan couldn't help but watch them, the girl and the dog, and realized that Bear wasn't just guiding her through the woods. He was anchoring her, giving her something stable in a world that had bent, burned, and betrayed her. The bond between them had grown wordless and unbreakable. Bear seemed to read her moods the way firefighters read smoke, subtle shifts in body language, posture, scent. If she paused too long, he nudged her forward. If she began to tremble, he pressed closer, a living shield. They crested a low ridge and stopped. Lila pointed down into a shallow ravine. Ethan followed her gaze. There, partially hidden by ivy and half collapsed under the weight of time, stood a structure. A squat, windowless building made of concrete blocks, maybe 20 by 20 feet. The roof sagged in the center. Its single door was covered in rust, a thick padlock still hanging from a bolted chain. Barbed wire fencing lay collapsed around it, mostly overtaken by vines. Ethan's stomach clenched. Brennan whistled low. Looks like it used to be a utility shed, maybe for mining. There was a small mining op up here, shut down years ago, Ethan said, but I've never seen this place on any fire patrol maps. Lila didn't descend immediately. She stared at the structure, unmoving. Then, with visible effort, she took a step forward, then another, until her boots crunched in the dead leaves at the clearing's edge. Bear followed without hesitation. Ethan and Brennan exchanged a glance, then drew closer. The smell hit them first. Not fresh, but faint, like mold, rust, and something acrid. It was subtle, like a ghost of something once worse. Ethan reached the door and tried the handle. It didn't budge. Brennan opened his satchel and removed a small lock cutter. Let's see what secrets this place has been keeping. The chain clattered to the ground a moment later. Ethan pulled the door open. It groaned like a wounded thing. Inside, shadows pressed thick against the walls. The interior was small and windowless, as expected. A stained mattress lay in the corner, mold climbing its edges. A rusted bucket sat in the opposite corner, and on the far wall, bolted to a rust-streaked anchor ring, was a length of frayed rope. Ethan felt sick. Brennan raised a flashlight and swept the room. This wasn't just storage. He approached the wall and examined the bolt. Fresh scratches. Someone tried to yank it free. Ethan turned back toward Lila. She stood in the doorway, unmoving. Her face was unreadable, but her fists were clenched. Bear pressed close, touching his side to her knees. Brennan lowered his light. This is enough for a warrant. Ethan stepped carefully across the room and crouched beside the mattress. It was damp, but something stuck out from underneath. A small toy. A rabbit, dirty and water-damaged. One of the ears was missing. He held it up. Lila's face crumpled. She took one hesitant step forward, then two, and reached for the toy with trembling hands. She clutched it to her chest, eyes squeezed shut, and sank to the floor beside Bear. Ethan knelt beside her, saying nothing. Brennan stepped back into the doorway. I'll call it in. We need forensics, photos, documentation. But Ethan, whatever happened here, it wasn't long ago. Ethan nodded. It was long enough for a child to lose her voice. They waited in silence until the sound of birds returned to the clearing. The fog rolled in thick that morning, shrouding the Asheville ridgeline in a soft, breathless silence. Moisture clung to every branch, every window pane, turning the world pale and ghost-like. Inside the firehouse, warmth from the cast-iron stove lapped gently at the corners of the room. The scent of cedarwood and faint coffee lingered, blending with the smell of damp earth brought in by boots and paws. Ethan stood by the window, one hand wrapped around a chipped mug, the other holding back the curtain as he watched a sleek black SUV approach. Its polished body looked out of place among the mud-splattered pickups and Ranger vehicles parked nearby. He didn't need to see the license plate to know who it was. "She's back," he murmured. Behind him, Lila froze at the table where she had been quietly sketching. The crayon she held slipped from her fingers, rolling across the floor. She didn't move to pick it up. Bear, lying nearby, lifted his head and stood, a low growl starting deep in his chest. Ethan turned. "It's okay, I'm here." But Lila's eyes were already locked on the door. Her shoulders tightened. She reached down and wrapped her arms around Bear's neck, burying her face in his fur. The knock came, sharp, confident, and far too loud for such a quiet place. April arrived just as Ethan was opening the door. She was soaked from the rain, her red hair plastered under a hood, her cheeks flushed with cold. Her breath caught when she saw who stood on the porch. Candace Thornwell, dressed impeccably in a gray trench coat and heels unsullied by the mud. She looked more like someone arriving for a deposition than to collect a child. Standing just behind her was a man, mid-40s, with a square jaw, close-cropped black hair, and an expression like he'd rather be anywhere else. His dark blue suit and leather portfolio marked him as legal counsel. "Mr. Clay," Candace said, her voice clipped, "I believe we've been through this. I am here to reclaim my niece." Before Ethan could reply, Bear appeared at his side, stiff-legged and bristling, and let out a bark so sharp it made everyone on the porch jump. "Control your animal!" the lawyer snapped. "No," Ethan replied. "He's telling us everything we need to know." April stepped between them. "What documentation do you have?" The lawyer opened his portfolio and withdrew a series of papers. Emergency guardianship forms, notarized. State recognition of temporary custody following the death of Lila's parents. We are acting within full legal parameters. April narrowed her eyes. "I've reviewed your documents. There are discrepancies in the medical history forms you submitted with her initial application." The lawyer blinked. "Discrepancies?" "She listed Lila as having a severe nut allergy. Lila doesn't have one. The medical report filed for Candace's application was fabricated. I checked with Lila's original pediatrician." Candace's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Before the confrontation could escalate, a third figure stepped from the shadows at the edge of the road. Agent Russell Brennan. He wore his usual slate jacket, and a badge gleamed at his belt. "Candace Thornwell," he called, approaching the porch. "We have new information that requires further review of your custody claim." She turned, fury barely contained. "You can't override court documents." "No," Brennan agreed, "but I can delay their execution pending a federal investigation into possible conspiracy and fraud." Candace stepped forward. "You can't possibly be serious." Before anyone else could speak, a small hand tugged at Ethan's sleeve. He looked down. Lila stood beside him, clutching something to her chest. A worn, brown teddy bear with one eye missing and a jagged seam along the back. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear and unwavering. Without a word, she pressed the bear into Ethan's hands. Then she pointed to the seam. Ethan knelt and turned the bear over. The stitching was rough, clearly done by a child's hands. Carefully, he pulled the thread loose. Inside was a small black USB drive. Everyone stopped. "What's that?" the lawyer asked. Lila didn't respond. She simply took a step back, hiding once more behind Bear's leg. Brennan reached out. "May I?" Ethan handed him the USB. Brennan inserted it into a small device he carried, synced to his phone. Within moments, his face changed. He tapped the screen, swiped, paused. "What is it?" April asked. "Files," he said slowly. "Documents, videos, transaction records, internal emails between Candace and executives at Genbro Mining Corporation, contract talks, shipment manifests, environmental study falsification." Candace blanched. Brennan's voice turned cold. "And an audio recording. Candace, your voice, instructing someone to remove the child from exposure and secure her until the transfer goes through." He looked up, his expression unreadable. That was dated 3 days before Lila's parents died in a so-called vehicle accident. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Candace's lawyer took a step back. I need to speak with my client." Brennan nodded. "You'll have plenty of time. Miss Thornwell, you're now considered a person of interest in a federal investigation. You're not to leave the state." Candace's expression cracked, just slightly. Her eyes darted to Lila, who was no longer afraid, only watching. Brennan turned to Ethan. "Thank you. If you hadn't listened to her, really listened, we might never have found this." Ethan looked down at Lila. She did all the hard work. April stepped forward, laying a gentle hand on the girl's back. "You saved yourself, sweetheart. You knew what they'd never find." and you kept it safe." Lila didn't speak. She didn't have to. The sun crept slowly over the Asheville Ridge that morning, golden light spilling through the dew-laced pine branches and painting the firehouse windows in hues of honey and rose. The storm had passed. The air outside carried the scent of wet bark and warm earth, but inside, something softer stirred, something more human than weather. The night air hung heavy with a deceptive calm, the kind that settles too easily before a storm. Outside the firehouse, the wind whispered through the pines like a warning, and the moon, a pale sliver in the sky, offered little light to the mountainside. Inside, Lila slept curled in her sleeping bag, one arm draped over Bear's massive shoulders. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea instead of whiskey, though the day's tension begged for something stronger. April, in flannel and sweatpants, leaned against the counter, flipping through an old veterinary manual. She never truly stopped working. They had kept the lights low, a habit now. Since Candace's temporary release under legal appeal, things had grown tense again. She wasn't permitted contact with Lila, but that didn't stop the silence around them from becoming loaded, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Bear stirred first. A single thump of his tail against the floor. Then he stood, ears forward, body tense. A soft growl, deep and low. Ethan set down his mug. "What is it, boy?" April closed the book. Bear walked slowly toward the door, nose twitching. Then the window shattered. The explosion of glass was instant and brutal. April screamed, ducking instinctively. Ethan leapt to his feet as two masked figures burst through the entryway. Black clothes, gloved hands, one holding a baton, the other something worse, a taser. Bear launched. His body collided with the first man in midair, teeth snapping inches from the intruder's face. The man shrieked, stumbling backward. The second raised the taser, but Bear was already twisting, already snarling, a blur of muscle and teeth. "Lila!" Ethan shouted, already running toward the girl's sleeping bag. April had dropped to the floor, grabbing the medical kit instinctively, her mind switching to triage mode before fear could paralyze her. Lila had bolted upright, eyes wild with terror. "Bear!" she gasped, her first word. Not a whisper, not a murmur, a full-throated cry that tore from her throat and cut through the chaos like lightning. Bear heard her, but the sound distracted him. The third man, hidden behind the second, stepped through the shattered side window, raised a handgun, and fired. The crack was deafening. Bear yelped and crumpled, his body twisting in the air before hitting the ground hard, a thud that stole the breath from the room. Lila screamed, "Bear!" April didn't hesitate. She lunged for Lila, wrapping her arms around the girl and pulling her toward the hallway. "Go, go, go! Emergency shelter! Closet in the bunk room!" Ethan tackled the masked man with the gun, rage flooding his veins. They crashed into the table, sending mugs and papers flying. The man fought back, but Ethan had years of fire rescue conditioning, and more importantly, fury. A siren wailed in the distance. Brennan. He'd been parked down the road all night, rotating shifts with a local deputy after the threats escalated. They'd kept it quiet, hoping not to alarm Lila. Now his presence meant survival. The intruders knew it too. One shouted something Ethan didn't catch, and within seconds they scattered, climbing through windows, disappearing into the dark trees like smoke. Ethan stumbled toward Bear. The dog was wheezing, one leg twitching. "No, no, no, come on, buddy," Ethan whispered, pressing his hand against the wound. Blood was spreading too fast. April reappeared, her hands already gloved, gauze and a tourniquet in her grasp. "Pressure here. Just keep talking to him." Lila emerged slowly from the hallway, barefoot and shaking. She didn't cry. She walked with purpose toward Bear, past the broken glass, past the blood, past the echo of her own voice ringing in her ears. She dropped to her knees and took his paw in her tiny hands. "Stay," she said. One word. Clear, commanding. Bear's eyes flicked to her, and his tail moved. Once. Brennan burst in moments later, weapon drawn. Behind him came two deputies, already scanning the perimeter. "Clear," he barked. "Gone," Ethan said breathlessly. "But they were sent. This wasn't random." Brennan knelt beside Bear. "We'll get him out. Now." "The vet at Hendersonville, Sarah's already on the line." April nodded. "I can stabilize him for transport." Lila still didn't move. She stayed by Bear, silent again but not empty. Her tears had dried. Her voice had arrived. Ethan crouched beside her. You were brave." She turned to him. "He saved me." "I know," he whispered. She reached into her pocket and pulled out another small drawing, a crude version of the firehouse, with stars drawn above it and Bear in the center, circled in red crayon. At the bottom, one word was written in shaky, uneven letters: Hero. The sun had barely risen when the call came through, a low vibration on the wooden nightstand, followed by a single flash across Ethan's old phone screen. Update from Vet Center, Dr. Chen. Ethan was already halfway awake. He hadn't really slept. The events of the previous night played in his head on a loop: shattered windows, masked intruders, Bear's cry as the bullet hit, Lila's voice rising in the middle of the chaos like a beacon of everything they'd been fighting for. He slipped out of the cot quietly, careful not to disturb Lila, who was curled beneath one of April's quilts on the bunk. Bear's blanket was folded at the foot of her bed, and beside it, the crayon drawing with the word hero scrawled beneath his name. Outside, the early light cast long shadows through the trees. Brennan waited by the truck, still in his rumpled field clothes, coffee in hand. His gray-streaked hair was messier than usual, his face drawn but focused, the kind of tired only federal agents and firefighters ever seemed to understand. Ethan nodded once. "Let's go." The drive to Hendersonville's emergency veterinary hospital was silent. The radio was off. The road snaked through dense forest, fog pooling in dips like secrets the night hadn't yet released. When they arrived, the tech at the front desk, young, olive-skinned, freckles across her nose, ushered them straight back. Her name tag read Lena. She moved quickly, but her voice was gentle. "Dr. Chen's been with him all night," she said. "She'd wait to speak to you." They followed her into the sterile hallway, where light bounced off metal carts and soft whimpers echoed from behind curtained rooms. At the far end, the door to the surgical recovery suite stood slightly ajar. Dr. May Chen was a tall, willowy woman in her early 40s, with sharp cheekbones, hair tied into a low bun, and eyes that missed nothing. She was known in 3 counties for handling critical trauma cases, both animal and human, in disaster zones and fire rescues. She had been a combat vet once, though she rarely spoke of it. "Mr. Clay," she said, rising from her stool. "Agent Brennan—" "How is he?" Ethan asked, his voice already tight. She hesitated. "Stable, for now. The bullet didn't hit his heart, but there was significant internal damage. We stopped the bleeding, repaired what we could, but he's in the danger zone. Organ stress, potential infection. We've got him on antibiotics and IV fluids, but the next 24 hours are critical." Ethan walked slowly to the edge of the recovery bed. Bear lay on his side, bandaged and still, a thick patch of fur shaved across his chest and flank. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes flickered open as Ethan approached. Recognition flashed. The tail thumped, barely. "Hey, buddy," Ethan murmured, kneeling beside him. "You held on." Bear blinked once, then let out a low, rumbling exhale. Brennan stepped back, giving them space. Dr. Chen quietly left the room. 5 minutes later, the door opened again. Lena returned. But this time, Lila was with her. She had insisted on coming. April had called Ethan just after they left the firehouse. Lila had woken up clutching the edge of Bear's blanket, refusing breakfast, refusing water, until she quietly whispered 2 words: "I go." She walked into the room now like someone much older. She wore her yellow raincoat even though the day was dry, boots untied, hair unbrushed. But she didn't look lost. She looked determined. Lila stood beside the table and looked down at Bear. Her fingers trembled, but she raised them anyway, brushing along the edge of his bandages with the same tenderness she'd once shown to her broken crayon drawings. Then she leaned in close. "Don't leave him," she whispered. Ethan's breath caught. Lila's lips moved again, hesitant. He needs you." Ethan turned slowly toward her. She glanced at him, eyes wide with something between fear and hope. "I do too," she whispered. It wasn't much, just 4 words, but they held everything. Grief, healing, the beginning of something like trust. She didn't say anything more, but her hand didn't leave Bear's fur for the next hour. Not even when the nurse came to check vitals. Not even when Bear stirred, blinking at her like a soldier too tired to fight, but unwilling to fall. Dr. Chen stepped in again and nodded, visibly moved. That's helping more than any of the meds. By the time the afternoon sun cut through the window slats, Brennan stepped out into the hall and took a call. When he returned, his expression had changed. "Candace Thornwell has been taken into custody," he said, low and direct. "They caught her trying to board a private flight out of Knoxville. She had 2 burner phones, a set of forged IDs, and $50,000 in cash." Ethan exhaled slowly. She knew it was over. "There's more," Brennan added. "The USB? The one hidden in the teddy bear? We cracked the last encrypted partition this morning." He handed Ethan a folder. Inside were color-printed screenshots of documents, spreadsheets, email chains, land development permits signed by corrupt officials, and, most damning, an internal memo from Genbro Mining outlining a plan to eliminate environmental obstacles, including 2 individuals listed as public health liabilities, Robert and Eleanor Rivers, Lila's parents. It was a hit. "They ordered the deaths," Brennan confirmed, "orchestrated the crash, suppressed the autopsy. Candace wasn't just complicit. She directed the cleanup." Ethan looked over at Lila, still seated beside Bear. "They tried to bury all of it," Brennan said. "But that little girl, she remembered. She knew." Ethan nodded, throat tight, and Bear protected the truth. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Lila finally stood. She placed something beside Bear's head, a new drawing, just finished. In it, Bear stood on a hill, proud and strong, eyes bright. Beside him were 2 figures holding hands, and above them the words written in red crayon, "Max needs me, and I need him." Spring had finally softened the chill of the Asheville mornings. Tiny buds unfolded on the branches outside the firehouse windows, and the river below shimmered like a mirror to the sky. But the warmth that filled the room that day didn't come from the sun nor the stove. It came from something harder won, something human, something chosen. Ethan stood near the kitchen table, his hands buried in the pockets of his best shirt, the only one without scorch marks or frayed seams. His boots were cleaned, his hair combed back, and for the first time in a long time, he looked not just like a man who had once belonged to the world, but like someone trying to belong again. Across the table sat Marla Jennings, a county social worker flown in from Tallahassee. She was in her early 60s, gray hair in a neat braid, gold-rimmed glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. Her voice had the careful calm of someone trained in diffusing tension, and her every move radiated government efficiency. But her eyes were kind, and they softened when they landed on Lila. The girl sat between Ethan and April, wearing a denim jacket and the flower-patterned dress April had picked out. Her fingers fidgeted with a corner of Bear's leash, even though the dog lay nearby, already resting his chin on her shoe. He was healing, still limping, still bandaged, but very much alive and alert. Marla folded her hands atop a file. "Lila," she said gently, "I know we've spoken before, and I know this is difficult. Your grandparents in Florida are lovely people. They've prepared a room for you. They've even adopted a golden retriever. They're very excited to meet you." Lila didn't speak at first. Then, slowly, she lifted her gaze. "Do they know his name?" "Who, sweetheart?" "My dog. Do they know his name is Bear?" Marla blinked. "Well, no, Do they know," Lila continued, her voice rising just a little, "that he barked so loud the bad people ran away? Or that he bled on the floor because he wouldn't let them take me? Do they know I was quiet for months, and the first thing I said was his name?" Marla opened her mouth, but Lila kept going. "Do they know I don't need a new dog? Because I already have one, and I already have a person too." She turned and looked up at Ethan, whose throat had tightened beyond speech. "I want to stay," Lila said. "This is my home." April reached under the table and took her hand, squeezing it once. Bear let out a low, content huff. There was silence for a moment, broken only by the ticking of the firehouse wall clock. "I see," Marla said softly. "Well, that makes this easier." She reached into her case and pulled out another folder. "Mr. Clay, your formal application for foster to adopt status has been reviewed, and, pending a few final home evaluations and routine background updates, it's been pre-approved by the state." Ethan exhaled. His eyes welled despite himself. "So she can stay?" "She can stay," Marla nodded, smiling. "And if everything checks out in the next 60 days, she'll be yours, officially." Lila didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She stood up from her chair, walked to Bear, and then turned, arms outstretched. Ethan knelt to meet her halfway, and she threw herself into his chest with more force than he expected. She hugged him tightly, burying her face into the curve of his neck. "Thanks, kiddo," he whispered, blinking fast. "You gave me a reason to wake up again." She pulled back just far enough to look at him, and then, in a voice so steady it could only come from truth, she said, "Thanks, Dad." April, standing behind them now, covered her mouth with her hand. Bear tilted his head, one ear flopping over the other. Then, slowly, he rose to his paws, walked beside them, and sat, pressing his warm body against both. That night, as the last streaks of daylight stretched across the mountains, the firehouse held a quiet gathering. Just a few people, Brennan in his worn field coat, April in her nurse scrubs, Dr. Chen who had driven in from Hendersonville, even Sarah from the bakery next door, who brought lemon cookies Lila devoured 2 at a time. There were no speeches, no banners, just chairs and laughter and food in mismatched bowls. At one point, Brennan raised a toast with a paper cup of sweet tea and said simply, "To families, the ones we're born into, and the ones brave enough to choose each other." Later, when the fire crackled low and most of the guests had gone, Lila found Bear resting near the open door. She knelt beside him, touched her forehead to his. "Home," she whispered. "We're home now." Sometimes, miracles don't come with thunder or bright flashes in the sky. Sometimes, a miracle is a little girl finding her voice again in the arms of a wounded dog. It's a man who thought he was too broken to love, hearing a child call him Dad for the first time. It's the eyes of a dog, silent, scarred, but full of knowing, that teach us what family really means. In this noisy and unfair world, God often sends us quiet miracles. A loyal animal, a child needing to be held, a moment when love finally overcomes pain. These are the miracles that don't shout, but they change everything. And maybe, this time, the miracle is meant for you. If you believe love can heal, if you believe God never forgets the brokenhearted, then take a moment right now to pray for every child like Lila and every soul like Bear. Comment Amen if you believe in miracles and trust that God is still working quietly, powerfully, in the moments we least expect. Like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs hope today. May God bless you and all those still searching for the place they can finally call home.